Hi, let me welcome you to another episode in the Roots series. Our current unit answers the question, how do people come to Christ? And let's continue that discussion as we look at the words mercy and grace. Now, grace and mercy are similar in some ways, but they're not exactly the same. Some would describe them this way. Grace is getting what we don't deserve, while mercy is not getting what we do deserve. Let me say that again. Grace is getting what we don't deserve, while mercy is not getting what we do deserve. I think that's a good way of contrasting the two words. Yet, while these two words have separate meanings, we need to see that God's mercy and grace work in tandem with each other. It's hard to draw the line between where God's mercy and grace are displayed. For example, there are 4 instances in the Gospels where people call out to Jesus for mercy. These all appear in at least the Gospel of Matthew and in some cases other Gospels. In 2 instances, there are parents who come to Jesus and want his mercy because their children are plagued by demons. And then there are 2 cases where there are blind men who call out to Jesus and ask for his mercy. And Jesus does have mercy upon them, but he also in his grace heals them. So it's hard to see where one ends and the other begins. And I don't think we need to split hairs. They're companion words. I want us to think for a few minutes about the role that mercy and grace have in our salvation. Let's think about mercy first. In Ephesians 2:4, we see that mercy is the result of God's great love for us. In Titus 3:5, we read that God saved us not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to his own mercy. 1 Peter 1:3 tells us, according to his great mercy, he has called us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So clearly mercy is involved in our salvation. What does that mean? That means that God takes pity on us. Mercy is God showing compassion and pity. But why do we need that? Well, the answer is because we are spiritually dead. Remember that? This is our condition, if you recall. Being spiritually dead means that we are incapable of contributing anything to being reconciled to God. Now think about it, okay? If there was something in us that enabled us to take a step toward God, to make a movement toward God so that we would be reconciled with him, we would not need God's mercy because we would have it in ourselves to make those steps. And what we need then is God cheerleading us along to make those steps and become right with him. But we are powerless and helpless. We've seen that over and over as we've read about the human condition. And God sees our need and he has pity on us, withholding judgment that we deserve. In other words, he shows mercy. Now, the word grace appears about 100 times in the New Testament letters, and it's hard to find a discussion of salvation that doesn't include a mention of the word grace. In Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9, Paul makes it clear that God's display of his grace is in no way connected with our works. God is not influenced by any activity on our part to display his grace. We can't do anything to earn new life, and we need to be clear that salvation is not God's part and then our part. Salvation is by grace alone. But Paul makes one more statement in this passage in Ephesians that shows us the extent of God's grace in light of the need that we have. And again, let me read verses 8 and 9 of Ephesians 2. For by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. Catch this again. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God. What Paul is saying here is that we are saved by grace through faith, and that even our faith is a product of God's grace. Now let me talk about that. Sometimes we talk about salvation as if it is like God throwing out a lifeline and then it's up to us to take hold of it. But What would make us do that while others don't? And why would we accept that offer and others would reject it? Over the last few weeks, we've talked about how the Bible sees us as spiritually dead. That means dead. I've emphasized that several times. It doesn't mean that we're just spiritually wounded. We're dead spiritually. We have no ability to enter into any relationship with God. We're incapable of making our way to God, not just limited in our ability. If we understand that, if we understand what being spiritually dead means, and that's what Paul has said in Ephesians and in other places, if we understand that, we have to come to the point where we realize that any faith that we have has to be the result of God's grace. And that, I believe, is what Paul is saying in this passage. He says, and by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God. And he is talking there about salvation generally, but really when you put the words together and understand them in what Paul is saying, he's saying that even our faith is a gift of God. It doesn't come from ourselves. Now, I want to encourage you here because I understand that you may find this a little off-putting perhaps, or maybe a little puzzling. I've linked to an article that I thought was very good, Is Faith the Gift of God? That comes from the Australian site of the Gospel Coalition, which is an excellent Christian website. And I have linked to that in the notes below. It's not a Reader's Digest type of article, but don't let that scare you off, okay? It's something you can understand. It takes a little bit of reading, and it's not a long article, but it will help you understand what I'm trying to say here, that faith is a gift of God, and therefore an expression of his grace to us, that he gives us that ability. Now, when I think about God's mercy and grace in my life, I think about how God brought a family from Delaware into our neighborhood in North Jersey. And that even though we lived essentially 2 large blocks away from this other family, God arranged the details of our lives so that the families met, became friends, and through that, my family came to Christ. My parents came to Christ. And ultimately, I came to Christ. None of that was our own doing. We didn't arrange the circumstances for that. That was God showing mercy and grace to my parents and ultimately to me. And I wonder, what's your story? How about you? How do you see mercy and grace at work in your life? If you think back about how you came to know Christ, I'm sure that you will see how God provided for all of what was needed to come to Christ. He provided the situations in which you found yourself, and ultimately, he gave you the faith to believe the message and to trust in Jesus. Well, that's what I want to talk about next time. I want to talk about faith. What does it mean to have faith? Have a great week, and thanks again for joining me for Roots. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I'll be glad to answer the questions as best I can. Take care.